The chamber of the Grand Council was vast, stretching high above the heads of the gathered rulers, its walls carved with the histories of the galaxy's greatest empires, stories of victories, alliances, and the downfall of ancient enemies. But among those carvings, there was no mention of humans, not a single line, for to the rulers of the galaxy, humans were nothing more than forgotten myths, bedtime tales whispered to frighten children into obedience. They had heard the stories before, of a species that had once walked the stars, fierce and unstoppable. But those were old fables, dismissed by scholars and mocked by leaders, and so the council laughed as the subject was raised once more. A trembling delegate from a minor world had dared to stand and speak, his voice shaking as he presented strange recordings collected from explorers at the edge of charted space. The screens in the chamber flickered to life, showing shadows against the stars, shapes so vast they filled the view, silhouettes of ships unlike any the galaxy had seen, silent, motionless, drifting as if they were waiting. The councillors scoffed, their laughter ringing out like thunder. They called it a trick of light, a fabrication by desperate explorers hoping for fame. One ruler sneered that if humans had ever existed, they would have revealed themselves long ago. Another mocked that the so-called warships were nothing but rocks drifting in space. The chamber echoed with derision, yet beneath the noise a faint unease stirred. The delegate tried to speak again, his hands trembling as he insisted the recordings were real, that explorers had vanished near the sector where the shadows were sighted. But his words were drowned beneath laughter. The galaxy's proudest voices had no patience for legends. Still, when the recordings replayed, some could not look away. The outlines of the ships were too clear, too purposeful, their silence too heavy. It was not the silence of dead stone, but of presence, of something alive and waiting. Even as the council mocked, a whisper of fear touched the chamber, though no one dared admit it. Outside the council halls, the whispers spread faster. Explorers told stories of strange encounters, of ships that drifted close without signal or light, only to vanish before they could be tracked. Traders spoke of convoys disappearing near uncharted regions, leaving behind only faint static. Soldiers muttered in their barracks that the legends of humanity were true, that the old stories of their wars, their rage, their unyielding spirit had never been lies. The council dismissed these tales as panic, but the galaxy's common people began to listen. For fear grows quickly when silence surrounds it. In the archives of forgotten worlds, old texts were pulled from dust, scrolls and carvings that spoke of humans, not as myths, but as warnings. Fragments told of wars where they had stood against entire empires and triumphed, of battles where their fleets had appeared from nowhere, silent and unstoppable, and then vanished without trace. The galaxy had chosen to forget these stories, burying them under centuries of pride. But now, as the strange recordings spread, those old words returned, whispered in the dark corners of space, giving shape to the unease that the council could not silence. The rulers, blinded by arrogance, continued to mock, yet in their private chambers some could not sleep. They replayed the recordings again and again, staring at the faint outlines of ships drifting against the stars, their minds heavy with questions they would not dare ask aloud. Why did the shapes look so deliberate? Why did the silence feel so heavy? Why did their hearts pound when they watched? It was as if the shadows themselves carried judgment, and though they told themselves it was nothing, fear grew quietly within them. In the outer colonies, unease became panic. Families refused to travel near the rumored sectors. Ships refused to carry cargo across those routes. Some worlds declared they would not answer the council's call to mock legends, for they felt in their bones that the legends were not dead, but waiting in silence for the galaxy to forget enough to make the first move. Silence became more terrifying than noise, and in that silence the galaxy began to tremble, though it still laughed on the surface. As the meeting of the council ended, the rulers left the chamber still laughing, but their laughter did not reach their eyes. The recordings remained on the screens even after the hall was empty, the shadow of the massive ships drifting silently against the stars, their presence pressing against the walls of the chamber, a silent warning that no one wished to acknowledge, yet none could forget. Outside, beneath the stars, explorers whispered that the humans had returned, that the legends were never stories, but truth hidden in silence. And though the council mocked, unease grew, like a storm building at the horizon, unseen, but inevitable. The galaxy thought humans were only legends, yet in the silence of the void, something waited, something vast, something patient, and though the rulers laughed, the people began to fear, for they knew that silence itself was speaking, and the message was clear. The legends were not gone, they were returning. The council's laughter still echoed across the galaxy long after the chamber had emptied, their proud words repeated in official broadcasts, their voices mocking the explorers and their recordings. They declared that humans were nothing but bedtime stories, that the shadows on the screens were tricks of failing equipment, that the galaxy had no reason to fear myths, and so their message spread outward with force, meant to silence whispers before they became storms. But whispers cannot be silenced when fear has already taken root. In the outer colonies the people did not laugh. Merchants who had lost caravans near the uncharted borders whispered their own truths. They spoke of ships that had vanished without distress calls, of engines that failed for no reason, of ghostly signals that flickered across scanners, shadows that moved and then disappeared. Families gathered in their homes and shared the old stories their grandparents had told them. Stories of humans who fought wars no one else dared to fight. Humans who had turned entire fleets into ashes. Humans who had disappeared not in defeat but in choice, waiting for the right moment to return. The council dismissed these tales as superstition, but in the silence of distant stars the people began to believe. Explorers returning from the outer rim carried stories that were harder to dismiss. They spoke of massive shadows drifting between suns, too large to be asteroids, too controlled to be debris. Their scanners had locked for seconds before going dark. Their recordings had captured faint outlines of colossal ships that moved without engines, without signals, ships that seemed to breathe with the silence itself, and though many of these explorers were mocked and shunned, their fear was too real, their voices too steady, their eyes too haunted, to be ignored, and so the whispers grew stronger, passed in secret, spreading like cracks through the proud surface of the galaxy. But the rulers refused to listen. They stood tall on their thrones, their arrogance louder than truth. They declared that silence was weakness, that humans had never existed, and if they had, they were long dead, erased from the galaxy's stage by stronger species. They sent fleets to patrol the uncharted borders, not to seek truth but to show power, and when those fleets returned empty, they used it as proof, laughing that there was nothing to fear. Yet what they did not speak of were the small squadrons that never returned, the patrols that went silent, the signals that flickered once before vanishing. Those losses were hidden, buried in secrecy, but their absence spoke louder than any report. Among the soldiers our knees grew heavier. They trained and marched as ordered, but in the quiet hours of the night they spoke to one another in hushed tones. Some admitted they had seen things they could not explain, flashes of shapes too vast to measure. Others confessed to hearing things, faint whispers carried through the static of their comms, words too quiet to understand but heavy enough to chill their blood. Some claimed they had dreamed of oceans stretching across stars, of forests rising taller than worlds, of storms swallowing entire fleets, and when they woke, the dreams clung to them like shadows. They began to believe the legends were not just real but awakening, and though they wore their uniforms with pride, their hearts trembled in silence. In the archives of forgotten planets, scholars who once dismissed myths began to reopen dusty vaults. They studied ancient texts and carvings, finding patterns in the stories, warnings that spoke of humans not as conquerors but as judges, a species that rose in silence and returned in silence, a force that watched and waited, their legends always ending the same way, with others laughing until the humans finally appeared, and then no laughter remained. These scholars tried to send their findings to the council, but their messages were blocked, their words buried, for the rulers would not allow such fear to spread. Yet the truth leaked out, as truth always does, and the whispers turned into a quiet roar beneath the surface of the galaxy. The traders were the first to act differently. They began rerouting their paths, refusing to cross the sectors where shadows were said to drift. Some lost fortunes, others were mocked as cowards, but still they avoided those dark routes, their instincts stronger than their greed, and slowly their choices spread. Shipping lanes shifted, colonies grew more isolated, and the economy of entire empires began to tremble. All because of whispers the rulers claimed did not exist, and yet those whispers were changing the galaxy. In the council's chambers the rulers still laughed, but the laughter was forced now, their speeches shorter, their smiles thinner. They could not admit it, but they too had seen the recordings in private. They too had watched the faint shapes move across the stars. They too had wondered why the silence felt so heavy, and though they continued to mock the legends in public, their nights were sleepless, their dreams uneasy, for in their hearts they feared that the explorers were right, that the Traders were right, that the soldiers were right, that the humans were not gone, not dead, not myths, but waiting, waiting in silence. The warnings had been given, but the galaxy ignored them, pride stronger than caution, arrogance blinding them to the truth, and yet beneath the surface fear grew stronger each day, until the whispers were no longer questions but certainties. The legends were real, the shadows were real, and soon the galaxy would learn what silence had been hiding all along. The patrol fleet moved into the uncharted system with engines burning bright, their hulls gleaming as they cut through the void. They had been sent to prove the Council's pride, to show the galaxy there was nothing in the darkness, nothing waiting, only empty myths. The commanders barked orders with confidence, telling their crews they would find nothing but rocks and dust. Yet beneath their words lay tension. For the soldiers remembered the whispers, the traders' warnings, the explorers' haunted eyes, and as their ships pressed deeper into the black, silence thickened around them like a living shroud. At first everything seemed normal. Scanners swept across planets and moons, detecting nothing unusual. The soldiers began to relax, mocking the stories themselves, laughing that their leaders were right, that the legends of humans were nothing but childish tales. But then the first flicker appeared, a pulse across the scanners, faint, brief, like a shadow brushing against the edge of vision. The technicians checked their screens again and again, but found nothing. They reported it to the commanders, who dismissed it as interference. Yet unease crept back into the crews. Whispers started among the lower decks, the kind of whispers that grow louder when silence presses close. Hours passed, and then the signals grew stronger, shapes forming on the screens, vast outlines too symmetrical to be asteroids, too deliberate to be debris. The crews froze as they stared at their monitors. The shapes drifted slowly, massive and silent, their size dwarfing anything the fleet had ever recorded. The commanders barked orders to recalibrate, to scan again, to find the truth, but the truth was already there, filling their screens with shadows of ships that moved without sound, ships that made the void itself feel smaller. The patrol's confidence shattered in an instant. The fleet transmitted messages back to the Council, their voices urgent, trembling, reporting contact with unidentified vessels. But the transmissions were broken, filled with static, distorted as if the void itself was swallowing their words. Only fragments made it through, words like massive, silent, they are watching, and then nothing, silence cutting the signal mid-sentence. Back on the fleet, panic began to spread, soldiers shouted over comms, engineers scrambled to keep systems running. Technicians prayed over their consoles, the commanders demanded control. But their voices no longer carried weight, for their crews had seen the truth, and fear is stronger than pride. One destroyer broke formation, its captain ordering retreat, engines flaring as it turned away from the shadows. But before it could escape, its lights flickered, its systems went dark. The ship froze in the void, drifting powerless, no explosion, no fire, only stillness. And then, as the fleet watched in horror, the shadow of one colossal ship moved closer, its outline blotting out the stars. For a moment its vast surface was clear, smooth and dark, larger than entire cities, larger than some moons, and then it vanished again, as if it had never been, leaving the destroyer lifeless, its crew silent, their voices gone. The remaining ships broke into chaos, some fired their weapons into the void, beams of light tearing across the darkness, missiles streaking toward the shadows. But every shot disappeared, swallowed by silence. Nothing struck, nothing exploded. The void simply absorbed their fury, leaving nothing behind. Soldiers screamed in despair, their weapons useless, their power meaningless. Commanders shouted for discipline. But no one listened, fear had overtaken them. The legends were no longer stories. They were here, real and watching, and the patrol fleet was trapped in their gaze. On one frigate, a young officer stared at his screen as a whisper came through the static, faint, steady, words not in any alien tongue, but in the old language recorded in myths, the language of humans. The words were simple, chilling, "We are not gone." The officer fell to his knees, his hands trembling, his voice breaking as he repeated the message to his crew. And though the commanders tried to silence him, the words spread across the ships like fire. Everyone heard them, everyone felt them, and hope crumbled. One by one the fleet's systems began to fail, engines flickered out, shields collapsed, life support faltered, ships drifted powerless. Soldiers sat frozen in their seats, staring into the void, waiting for the end. Some prayed, others wept, but none could act, for they were no longer masters of their own vessels. The silence had taken control, and in that silence they understood the truth. Humans had never been myths, never been gone, they had been waiting. Waiting in the shadows, waiting in the silence. The patrol's final transmissions never reached the council in full, only fragments carried across the stars, broken voices filled with fear, images of colossal ships flickering for seconds before dissolving into static, and then nothing, silence claiming the rest. The council dismissed the fragments as malfunctions, as fabrications, as tricks, but the soldiers of the galaxy heard them, the citizens heard them, and they believed. For the voices of the patrol had carried truth, and truth cannot be silenced, not when legends have already risen from the dark. The patrol fleet was never seen again, their ships gone, their crews erased, their names whispered in fear, and across the galaxy unease turned to dread. The legends were no longer bedtime stories. They were warnings, warnings ignored, warnings that had now become reality. The galaxy thought humans were gone, but their armada had appeared in silence, and the silence was only beginning. The council chamber was restless, its shining pillars and grand arches no longer filled with laughter but with unease. The rulers who had mocked the legends now sat in silence, their faces pale, their voices hushed. The patrol fleet had not returned, their signals had been broken, their reports filled with static, and though the council declared them lost to malfunctions or natural dangers, everyone in the chamber knew the truth. The shadows had been seen, the whispers had been heard, and the fear that spread through the soldiers had begun to seep into the hearts of the rulers themselves. Yet still they clung to their pride, unwilling to admit that the myths they had dismissed were walking once more. Outside the chamber, the galaxy itself was changing, colonies whispered in fear, traders refused to cross certain sectors, merchants rerouted their ships at great cost, entire routes went silent, and the economies of proud empires began to tremble. In the taverns and marketplaces, the whispers grew louder. Soldiers from the patrol had managed to transmit fragments before vanishing, recordings of massive shapes drifting silently across the stars, outlines of warships larger than any ever seen, voices trembling with terror, and one haunting phrase repeated again and again, "We are not gone." These words spread through the galaxy faster than any council decree, faster than any lie, and the people believed, because fear had already rooted itself in their souls. The council tried to respond with arrogance. They sent fleets larger than before, fleets meant to intimidate the silence itself, fleets that carried banners of strength. But fewer soldiers volunteered, fewer ships obeyed, for the fear was stronger than duty. The legends were stronger than orders, and many who were sent marched to their vessels with trembling hands. Some never made it to the docks at all, deserting before they could be trapped in the void. The rulers shouted of loyalty, of honor, of glory, but their words fell empty, for even they did not believe them anymore. In the shadows of their private chambers, they replayed the fragments of the patrol, staring into the outlines of ships that seemed too vast, too patient, too powerful to fight. The people of the galaxy began to resurrect old stories, tales once laughed at now spoken with reverence, stories of humans who had fought entire empires, humans who had turned entire wars in silence, who had disappeared only when they chose to, not because they were defeated, but because they had no need to linger. Priests and storytellers claimed the humans were never gone, that they had been watching, measuring, waiting, and now they had returned. Their silence a judgment heavier than fire. Their presence a reminder that the galaxy's arrogance was nothing before them. Children no longer asked if the stories were true. They asked only when the humans would reveal themselves. Rumors grew stronger with each passing day. Colonies claimed to see shadows moving across their skies. Traders swore that entire fleets had disappeared into the silence without a trace. Soldiers whispered of dreams that haunted them in the night. Dreams of oceans stretching into the stars, of forests taller than worlds, of storms swallowing armadas whole. And when they woke, the dreams clung to them like chains. Fear followed them even in the light of day. Commanders tried to crush these whispers, but the more they tried, the stronger they grew. Silence spread faster than sound. Fear spread faster than pride. The council held emergency meetings, their voices no longer mocking, but trembling with arguments. Some demanded to strike harder, to send the galaxy's full might against the silence. Others shouted that they should retreat, that they should seek peace before it was too late. Their debates grew fierce, but no answer came, for none of them had the courage to face the truth. None of them wanted to admit that their power meant nothing, that their fleets meant nothing, that their pride meant nothing. One elder ruler finally spoke aloud what the others feared, that the silence itself was Earth's weapon, that humans did not need fire or war. Their silence was enough to break the galaxy. His words were met with outrage, with denial, but deep inside, every ruler knew he was right. Back among the citizens, panic spread openly, riots broke out on worlds where the Council had promised safety. Soldiers refused to board their ships. Families begged their leaders not to provoke the silence further. Entire planets cut ties with the Council, refusing to obey orders that might draw the wrath of legends. And in the shadows of these worlds, cults rose, groups who worshipped the silence, who called themselves servants of humanity. They spread the belief that resistance was useless, that only surrender to the humans would save them. And though the Council branded them as traitors, their numbers grew, for fear gave them power. In the fleets sent to patrol the border, discipline collapsed. Soldiers jumped at every flicker on their screens, every pulse of static on their comms. Some swore they saw massive shadows drifting just beyond sight. Others claimed they heard whispers through the silence, words not in their own tongue but still understood, "We are watching." These whispers spread faster than any order, faster than any threat, and soldiers began to break, some abandoning their posts, others firing blindly into the void, their fear greater than their loyalty. The fleets meant to hold the line were now falling apart before a single shot had been fired. The galaxy's pride was crumbling, piece by piece, the silence pressing harder each day, and still the humans did not reveal themselves fully. They waited in the dark, patient and still, and that patience was more terrifying than war. The rulers who had mocked them now sat in trembling fear. The people who had dismissed them now whispered their names in prayers, and the galaxy itself began to understand the truth it had refused to face. The legends were not gone. The humans had never been gone. They were only silent, and in that silence they had become something greater than fear, greater than power, something the galaxy could not hope to resist. The border was thick with warships. The galaxy's greatest empires had gathered their fleets into one colossal armada. Thousands upon thousands of vessels lined in formation, their weapons gleaming, their engines blazing, their banners stretching across the void as if to remind themselves of their pride. Commanders shouted orders. Soldiers marched across metal decks. Technicians checked and rechecked their systems, all of them clinging to the illusion that they were ready, that they had the strength to face whatever shadows haunted the stars. But beneath the roar of engines and the bark of orders, fear sat heavy in every heart, because none of them could forget the whispers, none of them could erase the fragments of recordings, none of them could deny that silence itself had become their enemy. The Council had demanded a show of power, and so here it was, the largest fleet ever assembled, gathered at the edge of the uncharted sectors. Their presence meant to crush panic, to prove once and for all that the galaxy was still in control. Yet the very size of the fleet betrayed their desperation. Never before had they brought so many together for a single threat. Never before had they felt so uncertain of their own strength. Their commanders stood tall, boasting that the legends would shatter before the sight of such might. But even as they spoke, their voices trembled, for in the depth of their minds they knew the truth. Legends do not shatter, they endure. The first days were uneventful. The fleet patrolled, scanned, and waited. The silence stretched around them, heavy and unbroken. Technicians reported flickers on their sensors, but the commanders dismissed them, declaring them interference. Soldiers stared out at the stars, their hands resting uneasily on weapons they knew would do nothing. The waiting was worse than battle, every second of silence pressing deeper into their bones. Some swore they felt eyes upon them, not from one place, but from everywhere, a gaze so vast that it seemed to weigh upon their very souls. Yet still no ships appeared, only emptiness, only silence. And then, without warning, the stars began to vanish, one by one, sector by sector. The soldiers gasped as the sky above them darkened, not from any natural eclipse, but from shadows that moved, shadows so large they blotted out constellations, their outlines slow and deliberate, their surfaces faintly visible, and as the fleets looked up, the truth became clear. These were not asteroids, not tricks of the void, they were ships, colossal vessels drifting silently into view, each one larger than cities, larger than mountains, stretching across the horizon of space itself. And then more appeared, hundreds upon hundreds, until the sky was filled with them. The silence pressing heavier with each arrival. The galaxy's fleets surrounded, trapped beneath the weight of an armada that had come without sound. The commanders shouted for calm, for order, for fire, but their voices were lost beneath the terror that spread across their crews. Soldiers froze at their stations. Some fell to their knees, others screamed. The legends had appeared, not in stories, not in whispers, but in truth, their warships blotting out the stars, their silence louder than any war cry. The galaxy's greatest armada was nothing before them, insects caught in the shadow of giants. At last the commanders gave the order, weapons roared to life, beams cut through the darkness, missiles streaked forward, the void lit with fire brighter than suns. But as before, the weapons vanished, swallowed whole, no impact, no explosion, no sound, as if the universe itself refused to let them strike. The fleets poured their fury into the silence, but nothing reached, nothing mattered. The humans did not return fire, their warships did not move. They simply watched, their silence heavier than any weapon. Panic tore through the fleets, soldiers abandoned their posts, ships broke formation, some tried to flee, their engines flaring as they turned away. But one by one their systems failed, engines died, lights flickered. Entire vessels froze in stillness, drifting powerless, the silence reaching into their very machines and commanding them to stop. No explosions, no destruction, only paralysis. The fleets hung broken in the void, their weapons useless, their ships dead, their crews trembling. From the surface of one battleship, a soldier gazed upward, tears filling his eyes as he whispered the words everyone felt in their hearts. They are here. His voice was carried across the comms, reaching ships that could no longer move, soldiers that could no longer fight. And soon the whisper became a chorus, repeated across the fleets, a prayer, a confession, they are here. The commanders could do nothing, their pride shattered, their power broken. They sent desperate signals back to the council, begging for orders, begging for salvation. But the signals did not leave the system. They were swallowed by static, lost in the silence, and the commanders realized they were alone, face to face with the legends they had mocked, face to face with the truth they had denied. Their arrogance turned to ash in their throats. The human armada did not fire a single shot, did not speak a single word. They simply hovered in the void, silent, endless, watching, and that silence was worse than any battle, worse than any defeat. For it left the galaxy to wonder what would come next, left them to drown in the weight of their own fear. The sky was filled with warships, the legends returned, and the galaxy's strongest could only tremble, their pride shattered, their futures uncertain, their power meaningless, as silence ruled the stars. The galaxy's largest fleet hung broken in the void, their banners useless, their weapons silenced, their engines dead, and the sky above them filled with shadows so vast that even the bravest soldiers could not look without trembling. The human armada had appeared in silence, and in silence it had taken everything from them, not with fire, not with destruction, but with stillness. A control so complete that the galaxy's strongest warriors now sat helpless, staring at their own reflections in powerless screens, and knowing that the legends were true. For long hours nothing moved, the alien fleets floated like toys in a sea of giants, the human ships above them silent, cold, unreadable, not one broadcast, not one demand, only silence, and in that silence despair began to grow. Soldiers whispered to each other in broken voices, some prayed to their gods, others cursed their leaders for leading them into the trap. Commanders sent desperate signals back to the council, but every message vanished into static, lost before it could leave the system. They were cut off, alone, trapped beneath the shadow of warships that did not even need to fight, the weight of silence pressing heavier with each passing moment. It was a technician aboard a crippled destroyer who first realized their systems were not destroyed but controlled. His trembling hands traced the power lines, the readings, and he whispered to his captain that the humans had taken everything, not by breaking it, but by holding it. Their engines, their shields, even their lights were in human hands, and as this truth spread, terror deepened. The fleets were not simply defeated, they were owned, their lives held in the palm of a silent power that had chosen not to close its fist. Then came the leaks. Recordings captured by terrified soldiers before their ships froze began to spread through hidden channels. Across the galaxy fragments appeared on civilian screens, shaky images of colossal ships blotting out the stars, voices of soldiers screaming that their weapons had vanished, that their engines were dead, that the humans were real. One recording showed the moment missiles vanished into the void, disappearing as though swallowed by nothing. Another showed a colossal outline, a warship so massive its shadow consumed an entire squadron. And another carried the whisper heard across comms. A voice low and steady, "We are not gone." These fragments spread faster than any council order, carried by smugglers, by deserters, by frightened citizens, until every world had seen them. On distant colonies, people gathered in silence before screens, their faces pale, their hearts pounding. Children clung to their parents, asking if the humans were coming for them. Priests stood in temples and declared that the legends had returned to judge the galaxy. Rebels raised their banners, claiming the silence would sweep away the old powers, and entire populations refused to listen to the council's lies. They no longer believed their rulers, for they had seen the recordings. They had heard the fear in soldiers' voices, and they knew truth when they saw it. The council tried to stop the panic, tried to label the recordings as forgeries, but their own fleets had not returned. Their own signals had fallen silent, and their excuses carried no weight. Riots broke out on core worlds. Mobs stormed palaces, demanding answers, demanding peace. Demanding mercy from the humans, armies deserted, soldiers refused to fight. Entire fleets disobeyed their commanders, claiming they would not march into silence. The galaxy's greatest powers, once united in arrogance, now fractured, their unity shattered, their pride destroyed, not by battle but by fear. Back in the trapped fleet, despair turned to collapse. Some captains ordered their crews to abandon ship, but escape pods froze in space before they could fire their thrusters. Others tried to fire weapons again, but the systems refused to obey. Some commanders screamed for mercy into their comms, but only static answered, and across the dead fleet, soldiers wept openly, knowing they were no longer warriors, no longer free, but prisoners of silence, held by a power so vast it did not even need to speak. The humans had shown their existence, and that alone had broken the galaxy's strongest. One commander, his face hollow, his voice empty, recorded a final message, his words trembling but clear. "We mocked them, we denied them, we called them myths, but they are real, and they have returned. They own the void, they own us, and there is nothing left but silence." That message was never meant to leave the system, but somehow it did, carried across stars, reaching even the smallest colonies, and it spread like fire. The council could not bury it, could not silence it, and soon every being in the galaxy had heard those words, their last defense crumbling. By the time the 6th day passed, the galaxy no longer debated whether the legends were real. They no longer mocked. They no longer questioned. The truth was undeniable. The humans had returned. Their armada filled the skies. Their silence crushed entire fleets. Their patience had ended, and their judgment had begun. Everywhere fear reigned. Leaders begged for answers. Citizens begged for mercy. Soldiers begged to go home. But none of them could escape the truth. The humans did not need to fire, did not need to shout. Their silence was enough, and in that silence the galaxy broke. The council chamber, once the proud heart of galactic rule, was no longer a place of strength but of trembling voices. The rulers who had mocked the very idea of humans now sat hunched in their thrones of steel and crystal, their faces pale, their eyes ringed with fear. They had once laughed as children laugh at ghost stories, but now their laughter was gone, stripped from them by silence that pressed against the very walls of the chamber. The great empires had been built on arrogance, on the belief that nothing could rival them. Yet the fleets they had called invincible hung broken in the void, and the recordings of terrified soldiers had spread across every world, showing shadows so vast that the galaxy itself felt small beneath them. The debates began with shouting, voices sharp, desperate, rulers pounding their fists against the table, demanding explanations, demanding solutions. Some called for the construction of stronger weapons, claiming humans must simply be using advanced technology that could be broken with enough fire. Others called for the rallying of every fleet, every soldier, every ship the galaxy could build, to strike in one final surge. But their voices shook even as they spoke, their words hollow, for deep down they knew the truth. No weapon had touched the humans, no fleet had stood against them, and pride was already ash in their mouths. A smaller voice rose among them, trembling but steady, an elder ruler who had lived long enough to remember the first whispers of the human legends. He spoke of the old warnings carved into forgotten archives, stories that said the humans never vanished, that they watched and waited, that they returned only when the galaxy's arrogance had grown too loud. He begged the council to see what was clear, that their only chance now was not war, not weapons, but surrender, yet his words were drowned in fury. The proudest rulers could not allow themselves to kneel, not openly, not in front of the chamber. They roared at him, calling him coward, calling him traitor. But the silence in their own hearts betrayed them. They were cowards too, only too afraid to admit it. Outside the council walls, the galaxy was already collapsing. Riots tore through the streets of core worlds. Families cried for their children to be spared. Soldiers deserted their posts in waves. Entire colonies declared independence, vowing they would no longer obey rulers who led them to death. Temples filled with worshippers who no longer prayed to their gods but to the silence itself, asking for mercy, asking for forgiveness. Cults rose in secret, calling themselves servants of humanity, their numbers swelling each night, chanting that the galaxy's age had ended, that the age of humans had begun. The rulers had lost their people long before they lost their fleets. Reports arrived from across the stars, messages filled with despair, commanders who once boasted of their pride now begging for guidance, their voices cracked and broken, telling of fleets frozen in space, of soldiers weeping at their stations, of warships drifting powerless beneath the shadows. Some reports never finished, voices cut into static mid-sentence, as if silence itself had taken them. Others carried only fragments, whispers like prayers. They are watching, we cannot escape. The council heard them all, and with each message the chamber grew quieter, until no one could deny the truth. They had lost, not in war, but in spirit. The galaxy's strongest had already surrendered in their hearts. Still, pride lingered, a dying flame, and some rulers clung to it, demanding defiance even as their hands shook. But their words fell dead, for no one listened anymore. The silence was louder than their shouting. The silence of thousands of vanished ships, of millions of trembling voices, of an armada that had appeared without firing a single shot, until finally one ruler rose, his eyes hollow, his crown heavy, and he spoke the words they had all feared to say, "We must beg." The chamber fell still, the proud voices silenced, the rulers bowed their heads, some weeping openly, others staring blankly at the floor. They knew he was right. There was no other choice left, no pride, no weapons, no hope, only the chance that the humans would show mercy, and so, for the first time in history, the galaxy's greatest powers voted not for war, not for dominance, but for surrender, their hands trembling as they pressed their seals, their faces pale as they accepted their fall. The message was prepared in haste, every word chosen carefully, stripped of arrogance, stripped of pride. A message not from rulers to equals but from beggars to masters. We recognize our mistake. We recognize our arrogance. We beg you for mercy. We beg you to let us live. It was transmitted into the void, carried on every frequency, aimed at every corner of the silent system where the human armada waited. And when it was sent, the rulers sat frozen, their eyes on the stars, their hearts pounding, wondering if they had already waited too long, if mercy had already slipped from their grasp. Across the galaxy, people held their breath, citizens crowded around screens, soldiers abandoned their weapons to listen, rebels paused their chants, priests fell to their knees. Every living being waited, desperate, trembling, terrified, waiting to know if the humans would respond, if the silence would finally break, or if silence itself would be the last answer they ever received. The council chamber was silent, the galaxy was silent, and in that silence every ruler felt the truth pressing against them. They had mocked the legends, they had ignored the warnings, and now they had nothing left but fear. The fate of the galaxy lay in the hands of a species they had called myths, and the only sound left was the beating of their own hearts, waiting for judgment. The message of surrender drifted into the void like a desperate whisper, carried on every frequency the council could send, repeated again and again by trembling hands that once commanded empires. The words were humble, broken, stripped of pride. We beg for mercy. We beg for forgiveness. We beg you to let us live. For the first time in galactic history, the council's voice was not thunder but pleading, not command but prayer, and still the stars gave no answer. Silence pressed heavy over every system, over every world, over every trembling heart, as the galaxy waited. Hours passed, then days, and still nothing came, no signal, no broadcast, no movement from the silent armada that filled the skies. The human warships remained in place, colossal and motionless, their presence darker than night, their silence louder than any threat. On the worlds of the Empire's citizens gathered in streets, their eyes fixed on public screens. Children asked their parents why the humans did not answer. Priests begged in temples. Rebels shouted that judgment had already begun. But no answer came, only silence, stretching across every corner of the galaxy. A silence that grew heavier with each passing moment. In the crippled fleets stranded near Earth's system, despair deepened. Soldiers sat at their posts unable to move, their ships powerless, their systems still under unseen control. Some wrote last messages to families they would never see again. Others fell into quiet madness, whispering that the silence itself was alive. A voice greater than the universe. A voice that spoke without sound. Commanders begged into their comms for mercy, but no reply ever came. Only the endless hum of static, as if. The humans listened but chose not to answer. And then it began. Without warning, every screen across the galaxy flickered at once. In palaces and slums, in battleships and colonies, in temples and marketplaces. The light faltered and the stars vanished from view, replaced by a single image, Earth. The blue planet turning slowly in the darkness, its oceans glowing faintly, its clouds swirling in silence, its surface alive with storms and forests. The sight was beautiful and terrifying, for it carried with it the weight of truth. The legends were real, the humans had returned, and they had chosen this moment to show the galaxy their face. No sound accompanied the image, no speech, no warning, only Earth, steady and unshakable. The galaxy froze, every voice fell silent, every being bowed in awe or terror. Rulers clutched the arms of their thrones with trembling hands. Soldiers fell to their knees, priests wept openly, and then, at last, a voice came, low, steady, unshakable. A voice that filled every hall and every mind. You thought us gone. You thought us forgotten. You called us legends. The words rolled like thunder, though they were spoken in calm. And no one doubted them, no one could, for the voice was truth itself. The image of Earth grew larger, its oceans brighter, its storms crackling faintly, and the voice continued. We were silent, because we chose to be. We were patient, because we hoped you would learn. We watched, while you mocked. We waited, while you grew arrogant. But patience ends. Across the galaxy hearts pounded, rulers wept, soldiers covered their faces, children clung to their parents. The voice was not angry, not shouting, but calm, colder than any storm, heavier than any weapon. It carried the weight of judgment. And then the words that shattered the last of the galaxy's pride came. We were polite. Until now. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavier than the voice itself. The galaxy trembled, leaders collapsed to their knees, begging openly, citizens screamed in terror, riots broke out. Temples shook with the cries of worshippers. Entire worlds fell into chaos, for they all understood. The legends were never gone. The humans had never been myths. They had been waiting, and now their patience was over, their silence broken. In the crippled fleet, soldiers screamed as their ships powered down completely, lights dying, life support failing. Their final moments filled with the image of Earth glowing silently on their screens. Whole squadrons vanished from the void, not with explosions or fire, but simply gone, erased into nothingness. Others were left adrift, trapped in stillness, their crews trembling in despair, prisoners of silence. The galaxy's strongest had become nothing, their weapons dust, their pride ash. Back in the council chamber, rulers wept openly, some tearing off their crowns, others collapsing against their thrones. They begged into their comms, their voices breaking. We surrender, we surrender, we surrender.